Hey guys. Tonight we begin with a place far removed from the world as we know it. It's Strasbourg, the summer of 1518. The streets are narrow, the air warm, and the scent of bread drifts from stone ovens. But something is wrong here. A small crowd has gathered, not in anger, not in celebration, but to watch a woman dance alone, tirelessly. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just stepped into the summer the city could not stop dancing. It began with a woman whose name is mostly forgotten, though the records claim she was called Frau Trophia. But names hardly matter when history remembers you for the strangeness of your movements, rather than the sound of your voice. She stepped into the street one morning in July, when the air was thick and the cobblestones felt like they were holding the heat from the day before, and she began to dance. At first it may have looked like a game, or a small display of joy, a spin here, a twist there, perhaps even a smile. But anyone who had watched for more than a few minutes would have seen it. Something was wrong. There was no rhythm guiding her, no music drifting from an open window, no festival drum to chase, and yet she moved, and moved, and moved. By the time the sun began to sink, Frau Trophia had not stopped. Her face was pale, her hair damp with sweat, her feet leaving faint dark marks on the warm stone. A few neighbors stepped forward to ask if she needed help, if she was celebrating something strange, if perhaps she was drunk. But her eyes, they didn't look at them. They didn't look anywhere. They looked past. Unfocused, as though she were following something none of them could see. That night she collapsed into restless sleep, only to rise again the next morning and begin anew. The crowd grew larger. Some watched with worry, others with curiosity, a few with the cruel delight that people sometimes feel when they witness another's embarrassment. But soon, it became harder to laugh. 3 days she danced. Her shoes wore thin. Her ankles swelled. Her husband begged her to stop, and when she couldn't, he began to shout. But it was as if his voice had been lost in the same place where her own had gone. By the end of the week, others began to join her. No one called for them. No one invited them. One by one, they stepped forward, their faces slack, their movements jerky, until the street was alive with the shuffling and swaying of bodies that seemed both alive and half dead. The city of Strasbourg was not a large one, and its streets were narrow. The sound of it, the slap of feet, the faint gasps for air, the strange muttering of words no one could fully understand, began to echo off the timbered walls. There are moments in history where you can feel the fear settle before anyone has the courage to speak it. This was one of them. People began to whisper of curses, of the wrath of saints, of the devil himself setting his hand upon the city. In the stillness of the night, when the dancers slumped against the walls, still twitching in sleep, others crossed themselves or murmured prayers, terrified they might be next. The authorities tried to reason with the thing, whatever it was. At first, they thought the dancers could be reasoned with like drunkards, perhaps coaxed into rest. But the physicians of Strasbourg, armed with the limited wisdom of the time, decided that what these poor souls suffered from was an excess of hot blood. Their prescription? Let them dance it out. And so, instead of halting the strange procession, they encouraged it. Musicians were brought in, drums began to beat, fiddles began to wail, and the dancing plague, for plague it soon was, swelled in number. It is hard to imagine the smell of that street in July. The heat pressing against the bodies of hundreds of people who could not stop moving, the sweat soaking their clothes, the stench of unwashed bodies in the merciless sun. Flies gathered, children cried. Merchants moved their wares to quieter parts of the city. And yet the music played on, as though the madness had taken not just the dancers, but the minds of the officials themselves. One witness wrote that some dancers laughed until they collapsed, others screamed until their voices were gone. Some wept without stopping, tears cutting clean lines down their dust-covered faces. A few broke bones when their bodies could no longer carry them, but still their limbs twitched, jerking them upright again. And there were those, perhaps the unluckiest, who died in the middle of their steps, their bodies finally still in the way that life could not grant them. But this was no ordinary sickness. Strasbourg had known famine, disease, the strange fevers that swept through without warning. It had known war, and the cruelty of neighbors when times turned lean. But this was new. It struck without a clear cause, did not spread in the way a cough or fever might, and yet it was contagious in its own way. To see it was to risk being pulled into it. The records of the time are thin, but they all agree on one thing. It lasted for weeks. Some accounts claim over 400 were taken. The city, desperate for answers, sent for priests and pilgrims. Stories began to spread that the dancers had been cursed by Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, actors, and those afflicted by nervous disorders. Perhaps they had angered him. Perhaps this was a punishment, or perhaps, in some dark way, it was his form of a blessing. Though no one who watched believed that. Meanwhile, the city began to fray at the edges. Work slowed. Markets emptied. Fear crept into the homes at night, the kind of fear that is quiet but steady, that makes you listen for sounds you never used to notice. The scuff of a shoe in the dark, the low moan of someone unable to sleep. People stopped gathering in the square, except to watch the dancers. And watching was its own kind of sickness. Somewhere in those sweltering streets, under the eyes of neighbors and strangers alike, the line between life and death blurred. For the dancers, rest was not peace. Sleep was not an escape. And for those who stood at the edge of the crowd, there was always the question, when would it be them? It is strange how quickly the human mind can become accustomed to the unnatural. Within days, the sight of dozens of dancers swaying, twitching, and staggering down the cobblestones no longer drew gasps of disbelief. It became part of the city's background noise, as ordinary as the bell from the cathedral, the smell of bread from the bakeries, the clop of hooves on the street. But for all that, it was never truly ordinary. Every resident knew that the moment they looked too long, the moment they lingered, they risked something. Frau Trophia herself had faded into the mass, just another body among the hiving crowd. Her husband had stopped begging her to rest. His voice had grown hoarse, and his eyes no longer searched for hers. He stood in the shadow of the timbered houses, staring with the hollow expression of a man, already grieving for the living. There was no precedent for such grief in Strasbourg. Wives mourned husbands lost to wars or accidents. Parents mourned children taken by fever. But what did you call it when the person you loved was right in front of you? Their heart still beating, yet stolen by something invisible and merciless. The city's physicians, men with soft hands and the certainty of their learning, began to argue. Some claimed it was a natural ailment, perhaps born of heat and hunger. Others insisted it was supernatural, a kind of madness sent to test the faithful. But their voices were drowned out by the sound of the music. Yes, there was music now, almost always. The authorities had ordered it. They believed, or perhaps simply hoped, that if the dancers could exhaust themselves, the sickness would pass. Fiddles, drums, and flutes filled the streets, pushing the already frenzied movements into a fevered rhythm. And yet no exhaustion seemed enough. No collapse was final. There were whispers among the townsfolk that the music was not helping, that perhaps it was feeding the thing. But who could speak such thoughts aloud? To oppose the council's plan was to invite blame if the plague worsened. And so the music went on, and the dancers' feet became slick with blood inside their worn shoes. Children, too young to understand the danger, sometimes mimicked the dancers in play, twirling and stumbling with exaggerated groans, laughing at their own performance. Parents would seize them by the arms, dragging them away sharply, the laughter dying in the children's throats. It was not a thing to be mocked. Merchants began to lose business. The wealthy stayed behind closed shutters, sending servants to fetch bread and water. The poor, who could not afford to hide, passed by the dancers each day, crossing themselves quickly. For some, the sight was unbearable. A miller's wife was said to have locked herself indoors, after her sister joined the crowd, too afraid to step outside for fear her eyes might meet her sister's and pull her into the same fate. And all the while, the church bells tolled as they always had, for weddings, for deaths, for the hour, as if the city had not tilted into some strange fever, dream. By the second week, the streets held a constant low hum of dread. Neighbors no longer lingered to talk. Doors were closed quickly. Windows opened only to throw out water or to shout at passing boys who still dared to play. The dancers themselves became skeletal, their cheeks hollowing, eyes sinking into their sockets. Some bit their own lips until blood ran down their chins. Others clenched their jaws so tight that teeth cracked under the pressure, and yet their feet moved. One evening, a sudden summer storm broke over Strasbourg. Rain hammered the rooftops and rushed through the gutters, washing away the filth of the streets. But it did not stop the dancers. They moved through the downpour, hair plastered to their faces, clothes heavy with water. Lightning flashed, and for an instant their bodies looked like grotesque marionettes caught mid-step, pulled by invisible strings. Some said the thunder drowned the music, but others swore they could still hear it, faint and thin, carried on the wet air. The priests began to speak more openly of Saint Vitus. Stories spread quickly in times of fear, and the tale grew with each telling. They said the saint had once cursed a group of sinners to dance without rest until their bodies broke. They said he had done it out of righteous fury, and that the only way to break such a curse was to make a pilgrimage to his shrine. And so plans were made to send the afflicted, or those who could still be moved, to a chapel dedicated to the saint in the nearby mountains. But the journey was not simple. The dancers could not be convinced to walk in an orderly way. They stumbled and twitched, often breaking away from those trying to guide them. Some tried to flee entirely, running back toward the streets as if the pull of Strasbourg itself was stronger than any holy place. And for every one who was coaxed into leaving, another joined in their absence. By now the number had grown beyond counting. The city square, once a place of gathering for markets and celebrations, had become a writhing mass of bodies. The musicians played louder to match the chaos, their eyes darting nervously as they watched the dancers collapse, be dragged to the side, and replaced almost instantly by another. The sound was a strange and terrible blend. Laughter, weeping, gasps for breath. The relentless thump of feet on stone, and somewhere in that sound, beneath the clamor and the rain and the heat, was the question no one dared to speak aloud. If this could happen without warning, without reason, what else might be waiting for them, just beyond the edges of the known world? The air in Strasbourg had changed. It was heavier now, thick with the mingled smells of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the faint tang of iron from bloodied feet. Even in the cool of dawn, before the sun rose high enough to burn the stones underfoot, the scent lingered. People began to dream of it, the smell, the sound, as if the plague had crept into their minds at night. The council, faced with something beyond the reach of law or custom, doubled down on their desperate cure. More musicians were hired. They erected a wooden stage in the square so the dancers might have space to move without crowding the streets. Drummers pounded out steady, pulsing beats, as if forcing the dancers toward some inevitable collapse. It was said, though never officially confirmed, that one musician refused to play, claiming he had seen a woman's head snap back so violently to the music that her neck broke. The story was whispered with a kind of awe, though whether it was truth or a cautionary invention, no one could say. By now, the line between the sick and the well had blurred. Some who joined the dancers did so willingly, swept up in a frenzy they couldn't explain. Others still fought it, clutching walls or posts, until their fingers bled from the strain, only to find their legs dragging them forward despite their screams. Witnesses spoke of eyes rolling back in skulls, of tongues protruding as if the body were nothing more than a puppet, with its strings tangled. Those who collapsed didn't always rise again. The heat claimed some, their hearts faltering after days without rest. Others fell and were trampled in the crowd before anyone could drag them clear. Still, there was no stopping the music. The stage became a kind of altar, and the square a cathedral to something neither God nor man could name. In the richer quarters, shutters were nailed shut, and water barrels were brought inside to last the week. The wealthy muttered about fleeing the city entirely, but few dared to travel while such madness roamed the streets. And there were rumors, unconfirmed, unproven, but whispered with conviction, that nearby villages had seen small pockets of dancers appear as if the sickness was spreading outward. The priests worked tirelessly, moving among the afflicted with vials of holy water and relics wrapped in silk. They spoke prayers into ears that no longer seemed to hear. In private, some confessed to one another their doubts. Was this truly Saint Vitus's curse? Or was it something older, something darker, wearing the saint's name like a mask? Night brought no relief. In the flicker of torchlight, the dancers' shadows loomed monstrous on the walls, twisting and lurching with unnatural speed. The music softened after dark, but it never stopped entirely. Without it, the dancers made their own rhythm, stamping feet, clapping hands, shouting nonsense syllables into the still air. And then came the incident at the bridge. No one knows who started it, whether it was a dare, a delirious impulse, or some unseen compulsion. But a group of dancers broke away from the square and made their way toward the Ill River. Witnesses said they moved in perfect unison, stepping lightly as though following some unheard melody. When they reached the bridge, they began to spin in place, faster and faster, until their bodies blurred. One by one, they toppled into the water. The current was swift. Most did not resurface. Those who did seemed not to notice what had happened, climbing back onto the bank only to resume their wild, jerking dance. The council, faced with mounting deaths, could no longer pretend this was a passing illness. Messengers were sent to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Savon, with orders to prepare for the arrival of the afflicted. Those who could be moved were bound with cloth and rope to keep them from breaking away, then loaded onto carts. The journey was slow and harrowing, the constant jerking of the dancers threatening to overturn the wagons. At the shrine, priests performed rituals meant to appease the saint. Shoes were placed on the dancers' feet, blessed and sprinkled with holy water. Prayers were sung, bells were rung, and for some, though not all, the movements began to slow. The relief was not uniform. Some collapsed in deep, dreamless sleep. Others fell silent but twitched in place, their limbs jerking like dying insects. And still others broke free entirely, fleeing the shrine to vanish into the surrounding countryside. Back in Strasbourg, the numbers began to dwindle. The square was no longer overflowing. The music softened, then stopped. The stage was dismantled. But the city did not celebrate. There were too many dead, too many missing, and too many survivors who sat in their homes staring at the walls, as if afraid their own legs might betray them again. The streets remained quieter for weeks. Conversations were hushed, glances quick. The market stalls returned, but customers came and went quickly, as though some part of them feared the dance might return without warning. And in the evenings, when the wind was just right, some swore they could still hear the faint echo of drums, as if from far away. No one ever agreed on what had happened. Was it a curse, a madness, a poison in the bread? Or had it been something that walked the streets in the shape of joy, feeding on the bodies of the living? The city moved on, because it had no choice. But those who had seen it never forgot. And so, the memory of the dancing plague lingered, not in the official records or the council's proclamations, but in the space between heartbeats, in the quiet, breathless pause when music begins, and you wonder, just for an instant, whether your feet will still obey you. It didn't end at the shrine. That was the story the council preferred. A neat ending, wrapped in the authority of the church and the comfort of ritual. But outside the reach of Strasbourg's walls, other tales whispered their way through taverns and farmhouses. They spoke of the woman in a red shift who had walked into a village days after the music stopped, her bare feet leaving bloody moons in the dirt road. She smiled at those who stared and whispered, "It's your turn now," before her body began to sway again. No one saw her after that night. Merchants traveling the Rhine carried more than goods that summer. They carried stories of dancers in Speyer, in Basel, even across the river in Kiel. Some of these accounts were small, 2 or 3 people in a market square, moving with the same jerking, feverish rhythm, but they were enough to spark unease. If the plague could appear without warning, how could anyone claim to be safe? The theories began to multiply. One popular tale blamed the devil himself, claiming he had walked unseen through Strasbourg, testing the limits of human endurance. Another held that it was the work of a secret sect, a cult that worshipped movement as prayer and sacrifice. They would slip into cities during times of hardship, choosing a single person to bless, knowing that the contagion of the dance would do the rest. Others reached for more earthly explanations. Some physicians claimed it was hot blood, an excess of heat in the body that drove people to move until their hearts gave out. A few whispered about poisoned bread, rye infected with ergot, a mold that brought visions and madness. Yet none of these could explain the same detail, repeated in every survivor's account. They didn't want to dance, but they couldn't stop. Survivor testimonies were not easy to come by. Most refused to speak of what had happened. Those who did often broke down before finishing their accounts. One man, a baker named Eerie, described the first moment vividly. It was as if someone had grabbed me by the ankles from inside my own skin and pulled. I could feel my legs moving, but they weren't mine anymore. My wife tried to hold me. She's strong, she is. But I dragged her with me. I could hear her crying. I could hear myself crying. But my feet kept going. There were darker accounts too, ones that never reached official ink and parchment. A farmer swore he had seen his brother's face contort into something animal as he danced. Teeth bared, spittle flying. His brother's eyes locked onto him, unblinking as if daring him to join. And for a heartbeat, he almost did. The fear settled into the bones of Strasbourg like a winter chill that never left. Parents began to hum slow, low melodies to their children, warning them to stay away from strange music. Some households banned any sort of dancing at weddings or festivals for years afterward. And on certain moonlit nights, when shadows stretched long across the cobblestones, the streets emptied faster than usual, as if everyone had agreed, silently, that night was not a time to test their luck. But the strangest part, the archives tell us the plague of 1518 was the largest of its kind. But it wasn't the only one. Records from earlier centuries describe smaller outbreaks, scattered across the Holy Roman Empire. Even as far back as the 14th century, chroniclers wrote of midsummer dancers, who appeared in towns, their bodies swaying violently until they collapsed. The events always ended, eventually, but never without death. It makes you wonder, was Strasbourg the culmination of a pattern stretching back generations? Or was it simply the only time the world was watching? Because there's a detail that still troubles historians. After the summer of 1518, the records of these outbreaks vanish. Not fade, not diminish. Vanish. Entirely. As if whatever haunted those streets had finally learned to hide its footprints. And so the dancing plague became a story, then a curiosity, then a footnote. Until the only people who remembered were the ones who knew what it felt like to lose control of their own body. But I sometimes think about George's words. The man who felt someone pull at his ankles from inside his skin. And I think about the woman in the red shift, smiling as her feet bled, whispering, "It's your turn now." Because maybe the plague didn't die in Strasbourg. Maybe it's been moving ever since. Quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when the music starts again. The woman in the red shift was gone, and yet her absence left something heavier than her presence had. The townsfolk who had seen her felt as if the street itself retained her imprint. Like heat lingering on cobblestones, long after the sun has dipped below the rooftops. They whispered about her in the market, not in hushed tones of scandal, but in that reverent, almost fearful way people speak when they aren't sure whether they've witnessed madness or a visitation. The baker's apprentice swore he'd seen her in the alley that morning, her arms twitching like a marionette's, her eyes staring at something just above his head. Others insisted she'd walked straight into the Eel River without disturbing its glassy surface. The truth was, no one could agree, and that was the first sign that Strasbourg's reality had begun to fray. By the second week, the air had changed. It was not just heat anymore. Though the sun hung over the city like molten brass, it was the smell, thick with the mingled sense of sweat, unwashed wool, and bread turning stale in stalls abandoned for hours at a time. People were not working as they should. They were standing in doorways, leaning out of windows, gathering at street corners to watch. Not the usual bustle of traders or gossip, but watchfulness, the kind that flattens conversation and holds it in the throat. Something was unfolding in the open, and no one yet had the courage to call it what it was. The dancers came in twos and threes at first. They did not arrive together. Rather, it was as if each had been caught by an unseen hook, and reeled in from wherever they had been. A miller's wife, halfway through kneading bread, had wiped her flour, covered hands on her apron, and stepped into the road, her feet beginning their strange, irregular tapping. A cobbler's apprentice, muttering apologies to his master, had walked into the main square and joined the swaying, his head jerking as if he were listening to music only he could hear. They did not speak to one another. They barely looked at one another. But their bodies moved in rough synchrony, in the way a flock of starlings turns mid-air without a single audible signal. There was no music, not yet. Just the slap of feet on stone, the occasional grunt or sigh when knees buckled, and the low shuffle as skirts dragged through dust. Onlookers thought it a passing oddity, the kind of thing that would burn itself out in a few hours. But hours passed. The sun asked high, shadows shortened, and still they danced. Their faces were not joyous. If anything, their eyes were wide and unblinking. Their brows furrowed as though trying to solve some urgent problem in their heads while their bodies betrayed them. By evening, candles glowed from the windows surrounding the square. The dancers had not stopped to drink, to eat, or to rest. Some had collapsed, only to wake moments later and resume their strange steps. Mothers began pulling their children indoors. The innkeeper across the way shut his shutters, not for the night but in refusal, as though to close himself off from whatever this was. In a city that had weathered famine, disease, and fire, there was something more unsettling about this, because no one could name it, and it spread. By the third day, there were more than 30 dancers. By the fifth, nearly 50. They came from every part of the city, the Tanners' Quarter, the Weavers' District, the docks. People who had never spoken to one another before now shared the same relentless, shuffling fate. It was then that the first murmurs of divine punishment began to surface. Strasbourg had been a city of sin, they said. It was no coincidence that the cathedral bells had tolled strangely the week before, twice in succession for no apparent reason. Some claimed the dancers were possessed, that each convulsion was a demon tightening its grip. Others, quieter but no less convinced, believed these people had been chosen, not for punishment, but for some strange service, as yet unknown to the rest of the living. The council met in closed chambers. The discussion was not about how to stop the dancing, for none knew how, but about how to manage the optics of it. A city could endure strange happenings, so long as they did not draw too much outside attention. But word was already leaking along the trade routes. The city of Strasbourg was cursed, or else it had gone mad. Neither was good for business. By the seventh day, the council made an odd decision. They would encourage the dancing. If the afflicted could exhaust themselves, perhaps the plague would burn out. Musicians were hired. Drummers set up in the square. Flutes piped an unending, repetitive melody that wound through the air like incense smoke, sometimes pleasant, sometimes maddening. The theory was simple. If this was a sickness, it would run its course. But the musicians quickly realized something was wrong. The dancers were not following the beat. In fact, when the rhythm sped up, their feet faltered, their movements growing jerkier, almost painful. When the tune slowed, their shuffling became heavier, as though sinking into the earth. It was not joy, nor even compulsion toward music. It was something else. At night, in the cramped rooms above the taverns, those who had witnessed the day's events found they could not sleep. They heard the phantom sound of feet on stone, long after the square had emptied of onlookers. Some dreamed of joining the dancers, of moving until their own breath ran dry, waking to find their calves aching, as though they truly had been on their feet for hours. Husbands shook their wives awake from these dreams. Mothers checked on children, finding them sitting up in bed, eyes wide and unseeing, muttering a rhythm under their breath before lying back down. Strasbourg was changing, and the dancing was only the beginning. By the 10th day, the city no longer smelled of summer bread and livestock. It smelled of bodies in decline. Sweat had a sour, metallic edge now, mingled with the faint, sweet, sick scent of flesh kept too long in the heat. The dancers' skin shone unnaturally, their lips cracked and bled. Their eyes seemed to belong to someone watching from far away, a stranger peering through their own skull. People began to fall. Not stumble, not rest, fall. Mid-step their legs would fold beneath them, as though someone had cut the strings of a puppet. They would hit the ground hard, gasping like fish on a dock, sometimes clawing at their chests, sometimes simply lying still. The curious thing, the awful thing, was that if they were not immediately dead, they would rise again. Not minutes later, but seconds, jerking upright with the same broken rhythm, as though the fall itself were merely part of the choreography. Those who did not rise were carried away to side streets, or under the shade of the cathedral's looming stone. The priests prayed over them, though some did so with reluctance, muttering that perhaps these were not souls to be saved. One cleric, a gaunt man with eyes like a winter sky, whispered that he'd seen one of the dead move after the prayer, only to be shushed by his superior. The church could not afford whispers of miracles or resurrections that did not fit its liturgy. It was around this time that the city's healers began to break. At first they had attended the dancers, pressing cool cloths to their heads, urging water into parched mouths. But the afflicted rarely drank, and when they did, they would spit most of it out, as though the body rejected any aid. Bandaging feet torn open on the stones was futile. The wrappings came away soaked with blood and dust within an hour. It was like trying to mend a wound on a wheel spinning endlessly forward. Some healers stopped showing up entirely. One, a woman known for her gentleness with plague victims in earlier years, was found gone from the city. No one saw her leave, and no one blamed her. At night, the square was supposed to empty. The dancers led away to open barns, or the cathedral's shadowed cloisters where they might collapse in privacy. But the truth was, the dancing didn't stop when the sun did. In the deep hours before dawn, if you stood at a high window overlooking the city, you could see movement. Slow, spectral movement in the streets. Figures drifting from alley to alley, their feet brushing the cobbles in a near silent shuffling, their hands twitching in the air as if feeling for something invisible. No music played then. No spectators gathered. It was private, dreadful work. By the 12th day, there were more than 100. And the sound, oh the sound, was constant now. Day and night, the city's pulse was the steady slap of soles on stone. It drowned out the markets. It lingered beneath the sermons. Even the bells seemed to ring in time with it, as though the city itself had fallen into the rhythm. The council's plan to exhaust the dancers had failed. The opposite had happened. The dancing seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger as it spread. There were reports of people outside Strasbourg beginning to show the signs, small farming villages, where one or two were seen moving strangely, unable to stop. Even collapsing in fields. Merchants passing through refused to stop in the city now, fearing contagion. The roads leading in looked emptier than they had in years, and the taverns were running out of wine and bread. Inside Strasbourg, families began to hide their loved ones. If a son's foot began to twitch, if a wife's head began to sway as she peeled vegetables, they would shutter the house and pray no one saw. To be taken into the streets meant to be lost to the movement. Some whispered a name now, not to the clergy, but in dark kitchens and behind cellar doors. They said it was the work of Saint Vitus, the martyred child whose wrath could drive sinners to dance themselves to ruin. Others said it was older than the church, something pagan and wild, a spirit that lived beneath the city and had finally grown restless. A few, just a few, claimed they had seen something in the eyes of the dancers. Not madness, not pain, recognition. As if whatever had taken hold of them was calling them home. By the 14th day, people began to die in the open. They did not even fall with ceremony. They would dance one moment, their faces blank as parchment, and then they would crumple in on themselves, their limbs still twitching even as their breath failed. And still, the others moved around them, stepping over bodies without looking down. The city's heartbeat was no longer its people. It was the dance, and there was no telling when, or if, it would end. By the third week, reality in Strasbourg had thinned. Not cracked, not shattered, thin. The people in the square were not only dancers now. They were other things. At least, that's how it looked to those who had been watching too long. Some swore they saw feathers in the hair of strangers, as if they had sprouted from the scalp. Others said the dancers' shadows lagged behind them, not by a beat, but by several, like they were bound to something slower, older. One merchant, drunk and defiant, claimed he saw a woman's feet leave the ground entirely, hovering for the space of a breath, before she came down hard enough to split the skin of her heel. He laughed when he told it, but his eyes did not join in. The rhythm no longer came just from the human feet. At night, it echoed from walls, from the wooden beams above shop fronts, from the barrels in the alleys. A hollow percussion, as if the city itself were clapping along. Even those who swore they were untouched began tapping tables, bouncing knees swaying in place when no one was looking. Worse still, the dancers began to smile. Not the wary grimaces they had worn before, but slow, creeping smiles, as though a joke had been told in a language only they understood. Some began to mouth words, or perhaps syllables, to an unheard song. And if you stood close enough, you might notice that more than one mouth moved in exact unison with another. Food rotted in the markets. The smell of bread baking was replaced by the acrid tang of burning incense, which the priests now poured into the streets in thick clouds, hoping to smother whatever spirit had taken hold. It only made the air heavier, hazy, the kind of air that made you lose track of where your feet were. A boy, maybe 14, wandered into the square one afternoon. He was pale, too thin, his shirt hanging off him. His eyes darted from one dancer to another before locking on an old man who had been moving for days. Without a word, the boy stepped forward and began to match him. Every step, every sway, perfectly mirrored. Those who saw it claimed the boy's lips were moving, repeating the old man's movements like a prayer. Hours later, they were still there, still together, the crowd flowing around them like water around two stones. Then came the visions. A woman collapsed by the cathedral swore she had seen the Virgin Mary dancing at the center of the square, her robes swirling in colors too bright for daylight. A soldier claimed the opposite, that he'd seen the devil himself leading the steps, his cloven hooves striking sparks on the cobbles. A few saw both. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped and the air turned the color of blood and brass, a low hum began. It wasn't music, it wasn't chanting. It was deeper than that, a vibration in the ribs, in the teeth. The dancers moved in time with it instantly, their steps sharper, faster, more deliberate. Spectators clutched at their chests. A woman dropped her basket and began to cry, though she couldn't say why. That night, more than 30 new people joined the square. No one asked them why. No one tried to stop them. Because by now, everyone understood something they could not admit aloud. The city wasn't fighting the dance anymore. It was joining it. By the final weeks, the dance no longer belonged to the dancers. It belonged to the city. The square had become a living thing, breathing in time with the stamping feet, exhaling in the slow, ragged gasps of those who had been moving for days. The cobblestones were slick with a strange mix of summer rain and human sweat, and the smell that rose from them was something no wind could carry away. Those who had resisted the longest now found themselves swaying in their sleep, their dreams threaded with steps they did not know they'd learned. The butcher's wife was seen carving meat in rhythm, her knife rising and falling like a conductor's baton. The priest at St. Vitus's was caught gripping the altar as his knees buckled in a silent, jerking dance. And children, the ones who had been kept indoors, away from the square, began humming melodies they swore they'd never heard. There were whispers now, not just of possession, but of contagion, not the kind that passed through breath or blood, but through the eyes. If you watch too long, they said, you'll feel the music under your skin. The city leaders were desperate. They had brought in musicians at first, thinking the dancers might exhaust themselves into stillness. Now they did the opposite, trying to silence the streets entirely. Drums were broken, pipes smashed. The only sound they couldn't banish was the one no one made, that low, chest, deep hum, still pulsing from the square at night. And then came the night of the storm. The clouds rolled in without warning, thick, greenish, and heavy with electricity. A wind rose, sharp and cold, sweeping down the narrow streets. But the dancers did not stop. If anything, their movements grew sharper, more frantic, as if answering some unseen conductor's furious signal. Rain came in hard sheets, drenching hair, clothes, and the cobblestones beneath. Lightning flashed, freezing their silhouettes in impossible poses, arms outstretched, spines bent back at painful angles. mouths open in laughter or screams that the rain swallowed whole. It was then that the witnesses saw something they never spoke of plainly. They called it a shadow, though it wasn't shaped like any man or beast they knew. It moved through the crowd without touching a single body, but everywhere it passed, dancers dropped, not dead, but spent, crumpled as if their strings had been cut. Some said it was mercy, others called it hunger. By morning, the square was quiet for the first time in weeks. The survivors, if they could be called that, lay scattered across the stones, their chests rising and falling in shallow rhythm. The rest were carried away. Strasbourg never agreed on what it had witnessed. Some blamed mold in the bread, others a curse, others still a divine punishment for sins unnamed. But the oldest among them, the ones who had stood at the edge of the square and felt that humming in their bones, they kept their eyes down when it was spoken of, because they knew the truth was worse than any of those things. The dance had not been ended. It had only been postponed. The silence that followed the final drum beat was not relief. It was hollow, strange, as though the city itself had forgotten what stillness felt like. For days now, the air had been split by the constant pulse of music, pipes and drums, fiddles and the strange, nasal call of the shawm, notes that bled into each other until they became less melody and more compulsion. When the last note died, Strasbourg seemed to shiver in its absence. The dancers were not cured. Some fell where they stood, their limbs trembling violently as though the music still vibrated through their bones. Others swayed in place, eyes half closed, lips moving soundlessly, tracing rhythms only they could hear. And then in the quiet, the cries began. They were not the cries of joy, nor of pain alone. They were the cries of people dragged back into themselves too suddenly. The cries of those who had been living inside something larger, something overwhelming, and were now thrown into the fragile smallness of their own bodies again. Mothers found their daughters lying in the street, lips cracked and bleeding, their legs swollen and blue, veined from days without rest. Husbands pulled their wives into their arms, but found them slack, eyes rolled back, murmuring to someone who was not there. No one celebrated. Even the council members who had insisted on the music, those who had stood so firmly behind the theory that the only way out was through, now avoided each other's eyes. The city smelled of it. The sickness was no longer just in the square, it was in the narrow lanes, in the shadowed doorways, in the stillness of the cathedral where candles burned low and the air was thick with incense. The question began to whisper through the city, carried in low voices from window to window. What if the dance was not a sickness at all? What if it was a summons? The first priest to say so aloud was Father Matthias, a man with a voice like gravel and a habit of leaning too close when he spoke, as though he could force his words into you by sheer proximity. This, he said one evening, standing before a crowd in the square, is not a fever of the body, but of the soul. We have offended God, and he has sent Saint Vitus to remind us of his power. The dance will not end until we kneel. Some crossed themselves, others spat at the ground, but no one laughed. Father Matthias spoke of sins unnamed, of an anger that had been building for years in the heavens. The dancers, he said, were vessels, chosen to bear the burden of the city's guilt. And until the rest of Strasbourg joined them in repentance, the burden would grow. It was the kind of sermon you might expect to die in the air after it was spoken. But in Strasbourg, in that strange summer, it took root. By the next morning, there were whispers of processions, people carrying relics, singing hymns through the streets, not in joy but in plea. Someone swore they had seen the ghost of a boy dancing alone in an alley at dawn, his bare feet leaving no prints on the dust. Whether the story was true or not hardly mattered. The air was thick with belief. The council, sensing the mood, turned to measures they had once dismissed. The music stages were dismantled overnight, the instruments confiscated and locked away. In their place came relics, small, jeweled boxes carried by trembling hands, containing slivers of saints' bones, shreds of robes that had once brushed holy skin. The relic most prized was a splinter from the shrine of Saint Vitus himself, brought from a distant church by a messenger who claimed to have ridden day and night without stopping. It was a narrow thing, hardly larger than a matchstick, housed in a reliquary of gold and glass that caught the sunlight like a flame. It was placed at the head of the largest procession Strasbourg had seen in decades. The dancers were herded, not gently, into the streets ahead of it, their steps uneven, their bodies twitching. Behind them came priests in long robes, chanting in Latin, their voices low and insistent, threading through the air like smoke. The smell of incense hung heavy, mingling with the stench of unwashed bodies, of sickness, of the strange sour tang that clung to the dancers' skin. They moved through the city slowly, painfully, until they reached the edge of Strasbourg, where the ground sloped toward the river. Here, at the water's edge, the priests formed a circle around the dancers, raising the relic high into the air. It was not an exorcism, not exactly. It was something older, half Christian, half the shadow of something that had been in this land long before Christ was spoken of. Words were murmured that were not Latin, prayers that were not in any book. The dancers writhed. Some screamed, and then, suddenly, horribly, some began to laugh. The laughter broke something in the crowd. People stepped back, hands raised as if to ward off a blow. Even Father Matthias faltered in his chanting, his voice catching in his throat. The laughter was not human, not really. It rose and fell in strange, jagged lines, like music played on an instrument that had been badly tuned. A woman's head snapped back so far it seemed her neck must break, but still she laughed, the sound spilling out of her like water from a broken jug. A boy clutched his stomach, his knees buckling, his laughter bubbling up even as tears streamed down his face. One by one, the dancers collapsed into the mud by the river, their laughter fading to ragged gasps. By the time the last voice fell silent, the only sound was the river itself, sliding past in its slow, endless way. The priests lowered the relic. No one spoke. It was over, or so they thought. That night, the city did not sleep. The air was heavy and wet, the kind of heat that makes walls sweat and bread go stale before dawn. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked once and then fell silent. In the square where the dancing had begun, a woman in a grey dress stepped barefoot onto the stones. She was not among the dancers who had been taken to the river. No one knew her name. She began to move. Not wildly, not frantically. Just a slow, deliberate step. Then another. Her hands lifted as though feeling for a thread in the air. She smiled faintly, her eyes closed, and with each step her body loosened, the movements becoming smoother, more fluid, until she seemed less a person and more the echo of something moving through her. By dawn, she was not alone. By dawn, she was not alone. They emerged as if from the cracks in the city itself. Men, women, a barefoot boy with straw in his hair, a midwife still wearing her apron smeared with birth blood, an old man who leaned heavily on a stick until the moment his feet touched the square, when he let it clatter to the stones and began to move. The sound was not music, not yet. It was the scuff of bare feet, the faint slap of soles against stone, the collective breath of bodies moving in a rhythm. They did not speak aloud. Those who had survived the first wave stood in doorways and alleys, watching with the same dread one reserves for storms on the horizon. They had seen this before, felt it like a weight in the chest. They knew how it grew. By the time the cathedral bells tolled for prime, the rhythm was unmistakable. It had found its pulse. Some claimed they could hear faint music in the air, a thin, reedy sound, as though a shawm were being played from somewhere just out of sight. Others swore the beat was coming from beneath the ground, from deep under the old Roman foundations on which Strasbourg had been built. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Traders and millers stood frozen in the market, baskets of goods forgotten in their hands. Then someone began to clap. It was an old woman, her fingers knotted with age, standing in the shadow of the baker's guildhall. The sound was sharp, deliberate. Once, twice, 3 times. The dancer's steps seemed to catch on it, to lock into its pace. The boy with the straw in his hair began to spin. The midwife's hips rocked forward, then back. The old man, still without his stick, stamped his heel in time with the clapping. And then the first laugh came. It was soft, almost tender. The kind of laugh one might make at a private memory. But it carried, threading between the stone walls of the square. Another joined it, higher, lighter, followed by a third that broke midway into a sob. Within minutes, the air was thick with it, laughter and tears, music and silence, movement and stillness. The second wave had begun. By noon, the council had been summoned. They met in the upper chamber of the Guildhall, the heat pressing down so heavily that one of the aldermen loosened the ties of his robe despite the glares of his peers. No one wanted to say at first. The events at the river had been spoken of in guarded terms, as though naming them too clearly might draw their shadow back over the city. But the sound outside, the muffled pulse of dancing feet, the occasional burst of laughter, made evasion impossible. "They are not the same dancers," one man finally said. "These are new faces. The sickness has moved." "It is not a sickness," Father Matthias replied, his voice like a struck bell. "It is judgment. You cannot treat it with music, nor with relics, nor with anything made by the hands of men. We must give them to the church." Another alderman, whose family owned half the vineyards outside the city, slammed his palm on the table. "And watch our fields go untended, our wine spoil in the cask. If the streets fill with this madness again, trade will die. You would have us kneel while the city starves." The debate swelled, voices overlapping until the heat itself seemed to hum with them. Outside, the dancers kept moving. And somewhere in the square, the faint sound of a drum began, not loud, not insistent, just enough to thread into the pulse of their feet. By nightfall, the heat broke. Rain swept in from the west, heavy enough to drive the city's stray dogs into cellars and barns. Most people retreated indoors, grateful for the cool air. But the dancers they danced on, rain-plastered hair to their faces, ran in rivulets down their clothes, pooled in the hollows of the square's uneven stones. Bare feet slapped through the water, sending arcs of droplets into the air that caught what little light the street torches offered. And now there was music. No one could see the musicians. Some swore there were none, but the air was alive with it. Low strings hummed beneath the sound of the rain. A drum beat steady as a heartbeat, the bright, slicing cry of a pipe that seemed to hover just above the range of hearing. The music was not joyful. It was not mournful either. It was something older, stranger, a sound that carried both invitation and warning. One of the guards posted near the square swore later that he saw the dancers' feet leave no ripples in the water, as though they barely touched the earth at all. Another claimed that when he tried to step forward to pull one of them away, his own legs betrayed him. First a twitch, then a shuffle, then a full step into the rhythm. He fled before the second. By the third day of the rain, the city's fear had shifted. The first outbreak had been met with confusion, then pity, then frustration. This one was different. This one was quieter in its spread, slower but somehow deeper. As though it were not simply a fever moving through the body, but a thread weaving itself into the fabric of the city. The baker's wife disappeared from her shop, and was found hours later swaying in the rain with her skirts clinging to her legs. A novice from the cathedral choir was seen moving through the square with her eyes closed, singing to a tune no one else could hear. And then, most frightening of all, one of the alderman's own sons was caught in it. He had been standing with his father on the Guildhall balcony, watching the square with a mixture of fascination and disgust. And then, mid-sentence, he had stepped forward, climbed the railing, and dropped lightly to the stones below. He landed in a crouch, rose without looking around, and walked directly into the heart of the dancers. His father's shouts were swallowed by the music. By the seventh day, the city stank. The rain had stopped, but the heat had returned, heavier than before. The square reeked of unwashed bodies, of sweat baked into stone, of damp wool that would never fully dry. The market stalls stood empty. The cathedral's great doors were closed more often than open. The council, desperate, sent messengers to every village and abbey within a day's ride. Some returned with priests, others with physicians, still others with charlatans who promised cures involving ground gemstones or the burning of certain herbs. None of it worked. The priests preached repentance, the dancers danced. The physicians bled them, the dancers danced. The charlatans burned their herbs and muttered their spells, the dancers danced. At night the laughter returned, not constant, not from all of them, but enough to keep the city awake, enough to make even the most skeptical alderman wake sweating, heart pounding, from dreams of spinning in circles until the earth itself tilted beneath his feet. It was on the 10th night that someone died. A young woman, perhaps no more than 18, collapsed in the middle of the square. She did not stumble or slow beforehand. One moment she was moving, the next she was on the stones, her body limp and still. The music did not stop. No one moved to help her. Not the other dancers, not the guards, not the handful of onlookers who stood in the shadows. Only when the dawn came did they lift her, her limbs dangling loosely, and carry her away. By evening, she was forgotten. That was the worst part, some said later. Not the death itself, but how easily it was swallowed by the rhythm. How quickly it was made part of the dance. And so it continued. Days blurred, faces changed, some dancers vanished. Others appeared, but the number never seemed to shrink. The music was never seen being played, but it never faltered. The square became a place apart from the rest of the city, a place where the rules of exhaustion and mercy no longer applied. When the heat finally broke for good, when the first sharp edge of autumn slid into the air, the dancers began to fade. Not all at once. Not in any dramatic finale. One morning there were 30 in the square, that night 20. The next day 15. By the end of the week, only a handful remained, their movements slow and tired. And then, one morning, the square was empty. The stones were stained, the air still faintly sour, but there was no trace of the music, no clapping, no laughter. It was over. Or so they thought. The quiet was worse than the noise. The first morning without the dancers felt wrong, in the way an empty chair at a dinner table feels wrong. The space they had filled was now a hollow that seemed to draw the eye, to demand an answer that no one had. Shopkeepers reopened their shutters with the hesitance of people peering into a room where something terrible had happened. Children were herded away from the square, their mothers muttering half prayers, half curses. The air was cooler now, the light angled differently, but the stones still held the memory of bare feet striking in perfect rhythm. Some said the dancers had woken from their strange fugue and simply gone home. Others swore they had walked out of the city in a single silent column, taking the road east toward the river, and that not one of them had been seen again. There were darker whispers too. A cooper's apprentice claimed he had seen carts in the night, not for grain or goods, but for bodies, that the dancers had not left the city alive, that the council, desperate to end the plague without angering the church, had made a choice no one dared speak aloud. The council, for their part, said nothing. The cathedral bells rang more often in the weeks that followed. Masses for the afflicted were held, though no one named them now. The square was washed, buckets of water thrown across the stones, until it streamed into the drains. But even when the surface was clean, the smell lingered, not strong enough to wrinkle the nose, just enough to stir unease when the wind shifted. And in that unease, the stories began to grow. One told of a tanner's wife who, weeks after the last dancer vanished, was seen standing alone in her yard at night, her feet moving in a slow circle, her eyes fixed on nothing. Another told of a shepherd boy outside the city who heard music in the hills at dusk. Faint, sweet, impossible to name, and followed it for hours, only to find himself back where he had started, his clothes damp with sweat. There was even a story, whispered only in taverns after the wine had flowed, of an alderman's widow who kept a small wooden box under her bed. Inside was a piece of cloth stiff with sweat, cut from the hem of her husband's robe the day he stepped down into the square. She said it still smelled faintly of rain and stone. She said, if you pressed it to your ear, you could hear the beat. Winter came early. Snow muffled the streets, masking the scars in the square. The heat of that summer felt like a dream, the rain like something from another lifetime. But the shadow of it, the sense that the city had been touched by something it could not understand, never left. Parents warned their children to stay away from the square, though they never explained why. Merchants who had stalls there moved to other parts of the city. The Guildhall balcony, from which the alderman had once watched the dancers, remained empty. But sometimes, on still nights, when the wind was low and the moonlight silvered the stones, someone would swear they saw a figure there. Just a shadow, swaying gently, as if to a rhythm only they could hear. The plague became a cautionary tale. In some versions, it was a punishment for sin, in others, a madness born of heat and hunger. Some said it was an illness of the blood, others that it had nothing to do with flesh at all, that it was the soul itself that had been caught and spun until it came loose from the body. The further the years stretched, the more the edges blurred. What had been 30 dancers became 50, then 100, then 300. The woman in the grey dress became a martyr, or a witch, or a saint, depending on who was telling the story. And always, somewhere in the telling, there was the music. Sometimes it came from the hills, sometimes from under the stones, sometimes from no place at all. But it was always there, steady as a heartbeat waiting. A century later, the city's walls had grown, its streets had shifted. But the old square remained. The stones were replaced one by one over the decades. Yet the story clung to it, as if the ground itself remembered. On the 100th anniversary of the first outbreak, the cathedral bells rang at midnight. No one knew who had ordered it. Some said it was a prank, others that it was a mistake. But when the sound faded, there were a very few, who swore they could hear something else in the silence that followed. A pulse, a beat, faint but unmistakable. One young guard, posted at the south gate that night, later swore under confession that he had found his right foot moving in time with it before he realized what he was doing. The tale slipped into folklore. It was told to warn against idleness, against temptation, against pride. Traveling players staged it as a comedy in one town, a tragedy in the next. Minstrels wrote songs about it, though no two were alike. But every so often, a traveler passing through Strasbourg would hear a different kind of story. One that was not told on stage or sung in taverns. It was of a family who, for generations, kept their windows bolted on summer nights. Of a farmer who plowed in silence, never whistling or humming, no matter how long the day. Of a woman who would leave the city entirely every July, returning only when the leaves began to turn. And if you pressed the teller of such a story for why, they would only say, "It runs in the blood." Somewhere in the cathedral archives, bound between records of marriages and property disputes, there is a letter. It is unsigned, its edges browned with age, the ink faded to a soft brown. It was written in a hurried, cramped hand, as though the writer feared to be interrupted. It says only this: "They are not gone. They are sleeping. Even now, 5 centuries later, there are those who claim the dance is not finished. That it waits for heat, for hunger, for fear, for whatever strange and ancient trigger first set the feet of a woman in a grey dress moving without her will. In some versions, the music will return in the square. In others it will begin somewhere else entirely. But always, it ends the same way. With the first step. With the first step, the air seemed to change. Not for everyone, not yet. But for those standing closest to her, it was as though a new current had entered the street, invisible but tangible, brushing against their skin. It wasn't the heat, though the sun bore down mercilessly. It was something colder, like the feeling of being watched, or the sudden awareness that you are no longer entirely in control of your own body. Frau Trofia's foot came down again. Then again. Not the gentle sway of a woman passing time, but the heavy, deliberate stomp of someone keeping a rhythm only they could hear. Her eyes were not on the faces gathering around her. They were distant, unfocused, a gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the rooftops of Strasbourg. A boy no more than 10 tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Why is show?" he began, but his voice faded. His mother hushed him sharply. She didn't have an answer, and somehow, giving words to what they saw made it feel more dangerous. By the 3rd minute, her shoes were scraping the cobbles in erratic beats, the sound oddly sharp against the drone of summer flies. A man with a basket of onions had stopped mid-step, his goods swaying in his hands. The baker from across the way leaned in his doorway, flour still on his fingers, and for the first time in months, forgot about the price of grain. No one knew it then, but in less than a week, the narrow lane would be unrecognizable. Drums would echo off these same walls. The smell of sweat, thick, metallic, would cling to the air, and more feet would follow hers, as if compelled by the same invisible hand. At first, people laughed. Strasbourg was not a city untouched by oddities. There were drunkards and fools, traveling charlatans, strange pilgrims, even the occasional madwoman who claimed to see visions in the clouds. But this was different. This wasn't spectacle. This was endurance. She did not stop to eat. She did not stop to drink. She did not stop even when her knees buckled. By nightfall, the street lamps threw long shadows of her figure across the stones, flickering with the movement. Still, her feet struck the ground, toes raw. Skirt hem darkened with sweat and street dust. A pair of men, carpenters, strong from their trade, tried to hold her still. They said nothing to each other, but exchanged a glance that admitted fear. She did not fight them, exactly. She simply slipped through their grip, as if her body no longer obeyed the rules of muscle and restraint. The second day, her husband appeared. Hans Trophy was a gaunt man with shoulders bent by work, and the sight of his wife brought no joy to his eyes. He called her name once, twice, louder, but she didn't flinch. He tried to push through the circle that had formed, muttering curses, but was held back by the murmurs of neighbors. Someone whispered about curses, another about demons, another, with a smirk, suggested she was simply mad. But those who stayed longest noticed something else. The air around her seemed heavy, thick, as if the heat of the day had condensed in that one spot, making every breath harder to draw. Flies buzzed near her face. Yet she didn't blink. By the third day she was joined. Not by friends or family, but by strangers, a young man from the tanner's quarter, a middle-aged woman whose face was streaked with tears, a boy who couldn't have been more than 14. They didn't speak to her, or to each other. They simply began to move. Not quite in sync, but close enough to make the hairs on the neck rise. The sound was louder now. Dozens of feet, scraping, stamping, sliding across stone. Some barefoot, some in worn shoes that split at the seams. The rhythm wasn't music, it was chaos wrapped in persistence, a beat that refused to be silenced. The city council noticed. They had to. By the end of the week, more than 30 people were moving in that cursed way, through the market, past the wine merchants, along the narrow alleyways where the smell of boiled cabbage lingered. And unlike a parade or a festival, there was no laughter, only gasps, mutters, and the dull thud of weary bodies. Some collapsed where they stood only to be lifted, not to rest, but to continue. A man who'd been dancing for hours fell to his knees, hands trembling, eyes wide as if seeing something no one else could. He rose again with the jerky awkwardness of a puppet, pulled upright by unseen strings. The council met in haste, gathering in the stone hall with its heavy beams and cool shadows. The air inside smelled of parchment and wax. Words like plague and divine punishment were thrown back and forth. The priests spoke of sin, of penance unpaid. The physicians, their black coats stiff with dust, muttered about overheated blood and imbalances of the humors. Yet behind their voices lay something none would say aloud, the fear that it might spread. Not like fever but like madness, crawling from mind to mind. They tried remedies. They tried force. Nothing worked. One councilman, a man named Lorenz Balthasar, urged music, not to entertain, but to direct. Give them a place, he said, where they may dance themselves free. It was madness, yet desperation makes strange ideas sound reasonable. Musicians were summoned. Drums, fiddles, pipes. They set them in the square, where the dancers could be corralled like cattle, spinning and stomping under the merciless August sun. And the strange thing, more joined. The sound became unbearable. Not the music, but the slap of bare feet against hot stone, the grunt of breath pulled from lungs too long in motion, the guttural cries of those who could no longer feel their legs, yet could not stop moving them. From balconies, citizens watched, fanning themselves, crossing themselves, and some, though they would never admit it, felt an ache in their own feet. The faintest urge to step forward, to follow. By mid-August, the number had swelled to nearly 400. Children were warned not to look too long. The priests doubled their sermons. The apothecaries sold out of tonics. And the streets of Strasbourg kept dancing. They say Strasbourg has forgotten. That the cobblestones have been scarred clean by centuries of rain. That the square where Frau Trophia first began to move is just another tourist stop. The kind where the scent of coffee and butter drowns out anything older than yesterday. But it's late when I arrive. Later than I planned. The streets are mostly empty, the last trams rattling away into the dark. The cathedral looms above me, the sandstone blackened by time, its spire vanishing into the low clouds. My footsteps echo far louder than they should. I didn't come looking for ghosts. That's what I tell myself, anyway. But the guidebooks never mention what the locals say if you catch them in the right mood, after enough wine. That if you walk here in the wrong heat, a heat that clings instead of burns, You might hear something. I pass the square. The light from the street lamps is thin, their pools of gold barely touching the edges of the plaza. And there it is. At first, it's nothing, just the settling of an old building, the distant shuffle of someone locking up a shop. But then the rhythm becomes too deliberate. A step. Another. A pause. Another. Not hurried, not hesitant. Just steady. It's coming from nowhere I can see. And then, faint but undeniable, I hear it, a high, almost broken note. Like a bow drawn across a single string. Not music. Not really. More like a memory of music, the way a dream clings for a few seconds after waking. Every instinct tells me to move, but I stand there, listening. The sound passes, or fades, I can't tell. The square is empty again. The air is still, but in the quiet, I realize something: the rhythm hasn't left. It's under my own feet now. My heel! My toe! My toe! It takes an effort to stop. I walk away faster than I should, telling myself it's just my mind playing tricks. But hours later, in my hotel room, I find my shoes by the bed. Damp, as though I'd walked miles through the night without ever leaving. And I can't shake the thought. Maybe the music wasn't for them either. Maybe it's been waiting all this time, for me.